2. The complexity of animal awareness. The cumulative argument advanced near the end of the previous chapter supports more than the attribution of consciousness to certain animals. That argument can also be used to defend the view that mammalian animals have beliefs and desires, and that the explanation of why they behave as they do can frequently be given in terms of those beliefs and desires they have. Both common sense and ordinary language underwrite this view. The attribution of beliefs and desires to these animals is logically independent of questions about their having or lacking immortal or immaterial souls. The behavior of these animals is consistent with attributing beliefs and desires to them, and evolutionary theory supports the view that animals frequently behave as they do because they desire what they desire and believe what they believe. As Griffin observes, accepting the reality of our evolutionary relationship to other animals, it is unparsimonious to assume a rigid dichotomy of interpretation which insists that mental experiences have some effect on the behavior of one species of animals, but none at all on others. So strong is the cumulative support provided by the cumulative argument that we are justified in using it to pose a burden of proof challenge to those who deny that animals have beliefs and desires, unless or until these critics show that the reasons for denying that animals have beliefs and desires are better reasons than those supplied by the cumulative argument for affirming that they do. We are rationally justified in believing that they do. Not a few philosophers aspire to meet this challenge. True, none attempt to meet it by denying that either common sense or ordinary language is on the side of attributing beliefs and desires to animals, both domestic and wild varieties. And few, if any, are today likely to make the Cartesian assumption that consciousness is possible only for those who have immaterial, immortal souls, and on this basis attempt to meet the burden of proof. Yet there is no scarcity of objections that contest, either in whole or in part, the propriety of attributing beliefs and desires to animals, or of explaining their behavior in these terms. Not all these objections can be considered, and not all the controversies unearthed along the way can be examined fully. Nevertheless, the objections considered are a fair representation of the strongest, not the weakest, and the examination of controversial ideas, though far from complete, has, it is hoped, a degree of thoroughness appropriate to the occasion. 2.1. The Belief-Desire Theory. Let us begin with a fuller description of the position to be defended. Stephen Stitch, a philosopher at the University of Maryland and, as we shall see more fully later, one who raises some doubts about attributing beliefs to animals, offers an especially perspicuous characterization of this position, which he designates our intuitive belief-desire theory. It will be useful to quote his remarks at length. The theory postulates two different sorts of functional states, beliefs and desires, with normal subjects having a large store of each. Desires can arise in a variety of ways. One way in which they typically arise is as a result of deprivation. An organism deprived of food, water, or sexual release will acquire a desire for food, water, or sexual release, the strength of the desire generally increasing with the length of time the organism has been deprived. Also, organisms generally have a strong desire to escape from painful stimuli. Desires can, in addition, be generated by the interaction of beliefs with other desires. Thus, for example, if a dog wants something to eat, and if it believes there is a meaty bone in the next room, it may well acquire a desire to go to the next room. It need not acquire this desire, however. It may, for example, also believe that it would be severely shocked if it were to go into the next room, and thus not desire to go into the next room despite the presence of the bone. Alternatively, it might fail to form the desire without the influence of some overriding desire, like the desire to avoid pain. For it might simply be a rather stupid dog, or perhaps, like all of us from time to time, It may simply fail to make use of its beliefs about the bone. The belief might slip its mind. Desires, or at least a certain subset of them, are capable of causing behavior. Generally, if an organism now wants to move its body in a particular way, and if it has no incompatible wants, it will move its body in this way. Higher-level desires, like the desire to get its master to open the door, can result in behavior by generating, in collaboration with appropriate beliefs, one or more of these low-level desires that are capable of causing bodily movement. Like desires, beliefs have a variety of causes. The two most perspicuous ones are perception and inference. If our canine's master puts a meaty bone in the dog's dish, if the dog has a clear view of the proceedings, if it is paying attention and is psychologically normal, then the dog will form the belief that there is a meaty bone in its dish. It will also, no doubt, form a variety of further beliefs, some enduring and some ephemeral, as a result of observing its master's activity. In a similar way, perception also leads to the removal of beliefs from an organism's store of beliefs. Beliefs can also be generated by other beliefs. When tolerably coherent, the process by which beliefs generate further beliefs counts as inference. Thus, for example, Fido may believe that if he scratches at the door, his master will open it, and also that if the door is opened, he will be able to reach a bone. From that pair of beliefs, he may infer that if he scratches at the door, he will be able to reach the bone. Stitch makes it plain that the proceeding is not a detailed psychological theory. It is the barest and broadest outlines of such a theory. Even so, his remarks are enough to give meaning to the claim that the best psychological explanation of animal behavior will be provided by a theory which follows the general pattern of our intuitive belief-desire theory. Echoing La Mettrie's challenge to Descartes, Stitch observes that it would be remarkable indeed if a theory could be produced which explains the behavior of higher animals without appeals to beliefs and desires, and if this theory could not be adapted to explain human behavior as well. And echoing Griffin's observations about the implications of evolutionary theory, Stitch remarks that, in light of the evolutionary links and behavioral similarities between humans and higher animals, it is hard to believe that belief-desire psychology could explain human behavior, but not animal behavior. If humans have beliefs, so do animals. It is significant that Stitch ends this argument just quoted on a conditional note. If human beings have beliefs, so do animals. Stitch himself offers no argument to support ascribing beliefs to human beings, and neither shall we. As previously noted, there are some assumptions about the mental life of human beings that must be made in any work in moral philosophy, including the assumptions that human beings sometimes want certain things, that they sometimes act as they do because they believe doing so is necessary if they are to satisfy their desires, that they sometimes consider the beliefs and desires of others, and so forth. The challenge to defend these assumptions, like the challenge to defend our belief in the existence of other human minds, cannot be undertaken, let alone met, here. Here it must suffice to note that these assumptions are common to any work in moral philosophy, not ones that are peculiar, and this in a perverse or damaging sense to a work on animal rights. A view of human nature that reduces all human behavior to innate or conditioned responses to external or internal stimuli is, let us agree, a theoretical possibility whose merits, or lack of them, deserve our sustained critical attention on some occasion, but let us also agree that the present occasion is not that occasion. Assuming, then, what the advocates of alternative ethical theories will assume, that our intuitive belief-desire theory applies to human beings and our behavior, and in view of the collective force of the cumulative argument as outlined above, we are right to insist that the burden of proof falls to those who deny the application of this theory to animals and their behavior. To meet this challenge, it is not enough, for example, to assert that animal behavior might be uniformly explicable in terms of a stimulus-response theory, or to have recourse to any other theory that denies the presence of beliefs and desires in the case of animals, while affirming them in the case of humans. The challenge is met only if one can show that it is reasonable to deny that the belief-desire theory applies to animal behavior without implying that the same is true in the case of human behavior. There are at least two ways in which those who aspire to meet this burden of proof might endeavor to do so. First, they might argue that animal behavior cannot be explained by the belief-desire theory for the simple reason that animals, unlike humans, not only do not but cannot have beliefs or desires. Second, they might argue that even though animals do have beliefs, we cannot say what they believe, and so are unable to explain their behavior by making reference to what they believe. And, if desires presuppose beliefs, what they desire. Stitch argues in the latter way. R.G. Fry, senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Liverpool, argues in the former. Though the arguments these philosophers offer do not exhaust all the possible attempts to meet the burden of proof posed by the cumulative argument, they are, as remarked earlier, a fair representation of these arguments, so that it would be unfair to object to the argument that lies ahead that the real issues are avoided, or that it deals with ideas raised by straw, as distinct from real, men. The hope is that the strongest, not the weakest, contrary positions are examined. We shall consider Fry's arguments first. After Stitch's position has been characterized and critically evaluated, a number of further objections that challenge our ability to say what animals believe will be considered, and the positive approach to questions about the content of animal beliefs, set forth in 2.3, will be defended. The results of this account and its defense will then be brought to bear on questions dealing with related cognitive capacities of animals, for example, memory, and with whether animals are reasonably viewed as intentional agents. 2.2. Language and belief. Animals, Fry concedes, do have needs, including, for example, the need for food, water, and sexual release. However, needs are distinct from desires, and the possession of the former does not presuppose or imply possession of the latter. Plants need water, as do car radiators, yet we do not suppose that either plants or radiators desire water. The same is true in Fry's view of animals. They have needs but lack desires. The belief-desire theory thus has no valid application in their case. Lacking as they are when it comes to possession of desires, their behavior is not to be explained in ways that assume that they have them. Fry offers a number of arguments against attributing desires to animals. One, let us call it Fry's main argument, takes the following form. 1. Only those individuals who can have beliefs can have desires. 2. Animals cannot have beliefs. 3. Therefore, animals cannot have desires. I have elsewhere contested Fry's arguments in support of premise 1. I shall not reproduce them here. Instead, critical attention will be mainly of premise 2. Premise 1 implies that any time anyone desires anything, there is and must be a belief lurking in the background, so to speak. For example, I may be said to desire to eat a raspberry tart or to be warmed by the heat of the fire, but I could not be said to desire these things, it may be claimed, if I did not believe that the tart was edible or that the fire would give me warmth, or if I did not have some other belief, for example, that either the tart or the fire or both were conducive to my health. More generally, my desire for X may be supposed to require beliefs of the form, if I want X, then I must do Y, or since I want X and Y appears to be X, then I must get Y. On this view, what neither I nor anyone else can do is desire something without believing something about what is desired. Where the appropriate belief of the appropriate kind is missing, there the desire must be missing also. And since, on Fry's view, see premise 2 of his main argument, Animals cannot believe anything. They cannot, on his view, desire anything either. But why can't animals believe anything? According to Fry, animals lack beliefs because what is believed, the object of belief, is that a given sentence is true. And since animals lack linguistic proficiency, they cannot believe that any sentence is true. That being so, they cannot believe anything, and so, given that beliefs are necessary for desires, they cannot desire anything. Fry's reasons for excluding animals from the class of believers are more than a little reminiscent of Descartes' language test. But there is a relevant difference. Descartes, it will be recalled, holds that being able to use a language is the decisive test for consciousness. Fry concedes that animals are conscious. What he contends is that the ability to use a language is necessary if one is to have beliefs. And since, in his view, having beliefs is necessary for having desires, the ability to use a language is also necessary if one is to have desires. Thus, since animals lack the ability to use a language, they lack both beliefs and desires. The burden of proof in Fry's view has been met. The belief-desire theory does not apply to animals and their behavior. Some critics might challenge Fry by citing the linguistic competence of chimpanzees and other primates as showing that these animals do not lack language and so can have beliefs and desires. But there are 2 points to notice about casting one's criticism of Fry in these terms. First, as mentioned in the previous chapter, there is a good deal of controversy surrounding the attribution of linguistic competence to these animals. There is some question, then, whether we would be on stable ground if we credited them with linguistic capacities. Second, and more fundamentally, even if primates show that they are able to use a language, they would prove to be the exception rather than the rule. Certainly, most animals, including even most mammals, give no indication that they now possess or can acquire the use of language, in the sense of language central to Fry's argument. If we are looking for grounds on which to challenge Fry, grounds that would underwrite the attribution of beliefs to mammals generally, then Fry's position needs to be challenged at another place and in another way. That place is his view that what is believed, or the object of belief, is that a sentence is true. This claim is absolutely crucial to Fry's position, since unless he can persuade us that what is believed is that a given sentence is true, we have no reason to agree with him concerning which individuals do or do not or can or cannot have beliefs. We turn now to the reasons Fry offers in support of his view that what one believes, whenever one believes something, is that a certain sentence is true. Fry introduces his first reason by way of an example. We are to imagine that Fry desires to own a Gutenberg Bible, a desire he would not have, we are further to assume, if he did not believe that he lacked a Gutenberg Bible. The question is then put, what is it that I believe? To which Fry replies, I believe that my collection lacks a Gutenberg Bible. That is, I believe that the sentence, my collection lacks a Gutenberg Bible, is true. In expressions of the form, I believe that, what follows that is a sentence, and what I believe is that the sentence is true. And the same is true with expressions of the form, he believes that. What follows that is a sentence, and what the he in question believes is that sentence is true. This is the whole of Fry's first argument in defense of his view that what is believed is that certain sentences are true. The structure of this argument is not transparent. Indeed, it is not clear that an argument is given. What Fry says seems to be more in the nature of a declaration. But in fairness to Fry, perhaps what he believes is that 1, because particular sentences follow the that in sentences of the form I believe that, and he believes that, it follows that 2, what is believed is that the sentence following the that is true. And it is because Fry perhaps believes that 2 follows from 1 that he also perhaps thinks that he has provided an argument for his account of what is believed. Before assessing this argument, it is worth noting that Fry is not saying that we sometimes have beliefs about sentences, something that is uncontroversial. For example, suppose I believe that the sentence Jack and Jill went up the hill is a sentence in English. Then my belief in this case is a belief about a sentence. This is not Fry's view. Whenever I believe anything on his view, what I believe is that a certain sentence is true. And this is a position that is distinct from and is not entailed by the uncontroversial view that sometimes people have beliefs about sentences. Fry's view is not only controversial, it is false. Imagine that my son has a rubber snake and that, while waiting for a train, he takes the snake out of his pocket and sets it on the floor. Another traveler walks by, sees the snake, jumps away, and lets out a scream. I pick up the snake, apologize to the traveler, and counsel my son, explaining that the man believes the snake will harm him. All this is perfectly intelligible, and we should require of any philosophical account of the object of belief, Fry's included, that it explain how what is plainly true, we know that the traveler believes that the snake will harm him, can be true. Fry's stated position cannot explain this if we add the following possibility. The man who is frightened by the snake, the one who believes that the snake will harm him, speaks only, say, Portuguese, while I speak only English. For if, as Fry would have us suppose, what this man believes is that the sentence, "the snake will harm him," is true, and given that the man in question is totally ignorant of the English language, it follows that he cannot believe that any English sentence is true, including, in particular, the English sentence, "the snake will harm him." Fry's view, as stated by him, fails to explain how it is possible to do what sometimes we plainly are able to do, namely, correctly attribute beliefs to people who do not understand a particular language, and who thus cannot believe that sentences in that language are true. A possible reply to the criticism just made points out that the traveler is assumed to be conversant in some language, Portuguese. So perhaps it will be objected that Fry's view is not that the traveler must be able to believe that the English sentence, "the snake will harm him," is true, if he is to believe that the snake will harm him. Perhaps what he must believe is that the equivalent sentence in Portuguese is true. More generally, perhaps what Fry believes is this. Whenever we say that some individual, A, believes something, what we affirm is that A believes that some sentence is true, that sentence being a particular sentence in English or its equivalent in Portuguese, in German, or in some other language. In this way, it might be claimed, Fry could revise his somewhat unguarded characterization of what is believed, and thereby respond to the criticism raised in the previous paragraph. Thus revised, Fry's position, which initially seemed noteworthy for its simplicity, now runs the risk of being buried by its unadvertised complexity. If different people who speak different languages can believe the same thing, despite expressing their beliefs in different words from different languages, then what is believed by any one of them cannot be reduced to the belief that a particular sentence in a particular language is true. For example, the English sentence, "the snake will harm him." And if what is believed is not reducible to the belief that a particular sentence in a particular language is true, it is very unclear what sense it can make to persist in claiming that what is believed is that a sentence is true. The idea that sentences are what are believed, but that these sentences are not sentences in any particular language, strains one's powers of comprehension, to say the least. A further objection to Fry takes the following form. Suppose the man who, upon seeing the snake, jumps away in terror, happens not to be able to speak or comprehend any language. Both physically and intellectually, let us suppose, he lacks the necessary wherewithal to acquire the use of language. On Fry's view, even when revised, what we cannot do is attribute any belief to this man, since he is totally bereft of any linguistic competence. He cannot believe that any sentence in any language is true or false. On Fry's view, he cannot believe anything. So here we have this man. His eyes bulge, he jumps away, his face wears an expression of extreme terror. But does he believe anything? Is there something about what our fellow traveler perceives that leads him to believe that there is something to be afraid of? On Fry's view, there is not. Lacking in language, the traveler is lacking in beliefs also. Not only does he not believe anything, he cannot believe anything. What shall we say of a view that leads to a conclusion such as this? Reason would not look with disfavor on its rejection, unless we can be shown why it is a mistake to attribute beliefs to individuals who lack the ability to formulate or comprehend sentences, and Fry fails to show why this is a mistake. The traveler's behavior, understood in concert with the other tenets of the cumulative argument, is sufficient reason to attribute beliefs to him. And those who demur, denying the propriety of speaking in this way, would not show that the traveler lacks beliefs. What they would show is that they do not understand the ordinary use of sentences of the form, he believes that P. Fry is likely to view this last objection with a jaundiced eye. He is likely to say that his linguistic intuitions differ, alleging that, in his view, we ought not to say that the traveler believes that the snake will harm him. But this, he will say, settles nothing, since it fails to settle whose linguistic intuitions are correct. Besides, the case of the linguistically deficient traveler is likely to be judged a deviant case by Fry, one that departs significantly from normal cases of belief attribution. And it is precisely because it is, in Fry's view, a deviant case, that he is likely to dismiss it or downplay its relevance to the analysis of belief. If Fry's analysis fits the normal case as well, then how can it be reasonable to challenge his analysis by dredging up deviant cases? That, very likely, is the sort of response Fry would make to the argument involving the linguistically deficient traveler. This likely response of Fry's assumes that there are normal cases of the attribution of belief, that is, cases where, in attributing beliefs to certain individuals, the attribution of belief is clearly justified. Deviant cases are cases where beliefs are attributed to individuals who, in one way or another, are relevantly unlike those individuals to whom beliefs are attributed in these normal cases. Which individuals are those to whom beliefs are attributed in these normal cases? Fry's position is that these individuals are normal adult human beings, individuals who, so it turns out, happen to be able to use a language, and who, by this means, are able to express their beliefs linguistically. The linguistically deficient traveler of our earlier example represents a deviant case. He is not a normal adult human being and lacks language. And Fry is likely to argue, one ought not to contest the adequacy of a proposed analysis of belief, one that fits the normal case as well, by, in his words, seizing upon the case of those deviant humans among us. 3 replies must suffice here. First, what counts as a normal or a deviant case is not the neutral matter Fry evidently assumes that it is. On Fry's understanding of these notions, the linguistically deficient traveler is a deviant case. But this is to assume the greater part of what Fry is obliged to show, since on some accounts of the grounds for the attribution of belief, for example, if a given organism's behaving in a certain way is sufficient for attributing beliefs to it, the traveler provides us with a normal, not a deviant case. In other words, before Fry could be justified in marking off as the only normal cases, those cases where beliefs are attributed to individuals who express their beliefs linguistically, he should be required to show that alternative accounts of the grounds of belief attribution are deficient. The mere advocacy of Fry's favored view regarding the object of belief does not show that this view is correct. That is the first point to be made regarding Fry's understanding of normal cases. Second, quite apart from the specific question of animals' beliefs, Fry's general understanding of how to assess proposed analyses of difficult ideas is radically conservative. Essentially, what Fry believes is this: if a proposed analysis fits the normal cases, then that is enough, and it is quite improper to contest its adequacy by dredging up this or that deviant case. This is a quite remarkable view for a philosopher to take, since it rules out the familiar, proper method of testing proposed analyses of ideas by considering possible counterexamples, cases that, in one way or another, depart from normal cases, and thus are in that sense deviant. Fry's view would presumably countenance, for example, an analysis of a human being that included has two arms, since this is the normal condition of those who are human. If we were to contest this analysis by citing one-armed humans, one who accepts Fry's position presumably could dismiss our challenge on the grounds that one-armed humans are deviant cases, and so have no role to play in the dispassionate assessment of proposed analyses. Such a view of how rival analyses are to be tested should find no favor among philosophers. Part of what conceptual analyses seek to lay bare are the conditions that must be met if a given concept can possibly be properly applied. One wants to know the limits of its intelligible application, not just what applications are normal. To suppose that its limits can be found just by getting clear on its normal applications is fundamentally confused, in some ways like supposing that we can discover the age of the oldest living person by determining the normal life expectancy of people alive today. Even though it is true that normal adult human beings, A, have beliefs, and B, can and sometimes do express their beliefs linguistically, it does not follow that it is a logical truth that only those individuals who can express beliefs in language can have them. Begged questions to one side, Fry's reasons for dismissing the relevance of deviant cases bespeaks a too narrow view about the point of, and the proper way to assess, proposed analyses of concepts or ideas. Third, Fry's understanding of normal cases when coupled with his view about the object of belief leads to the conclusion that no one can learn a language, and this in turn leads to the unwelcome result that no one can believe anything, if the object of belief is, as Fry says it is, that a particular sentence is true. The first part of the argument showing this can be formulated as follows. 1. If, in order to believe anything, one must believe that certain sentences are true, then those individuals who do not understand sentences cannot believe anything. 2. Young children, before they learn a language, do not understand sentences. 3. Therefore, young children cannot believe anything. The first step merely restates Fry's view regarding the object of belief. The second sets forth an evident truism, and the third states the conclusion that follows from 1 and 2. Where does this argument lead? This is brought out by the following steps, which build upon the previous ones. 4. If young children cannot have beliefs, then they cannot be taught to use a language. 5. Therefore, young children cannot be taught to use a language. The crucial step is step 4, and its defense involves the following observations that are in some ways reminiscent of the discussion in the previous chapter of Descartes' language test. Consider what is involved in teaching young children the use of words in a language such as English. Characteristically, we begin by holding up or pointing to objects and giving their names: ball, mother, dog, bottle. If baby Jane picks up on what we are attempting to teach, the time comes when she is able to give the correct name. She says ball when the object we hold or point to is a ball. To explain how baby Jane learns to do this would be no mean accomplishment certainly, and it is well beyond the range of the present work to undertake this task. The sole point that needs to be made here is this. Unless baby Jane comes to believe that there is a particular thing we are referring to when we say the word ball, all manner of instruction in the use of the word ball will be for naught. She simply will not come to learn the meaning of the word. Without a pre-verbal belief on her part, one that picks out the ball as the thing to which we are referring when we say ball, her linguistic education cannot get underway. As Step 5 declares, she will be in a situation where she simply cannot be taught to use a language. Fry's view of the object of belief consigns baby Jane to just this fate. Given his view, baby Jane not only will not, she cannot acquire linguistic proficiency. This is because, according to Fry, to believe something is to believe that a certain sentence is true. something baby Jane most certainly is incapable of doing before acquiring the use of language. Accordingly, since to learn a language, baby Jane must have beliefs about what we are referring to, and since, on Fry's view, to have a belief is to believe that a certain sentence is true, it follows that baby Jane cannot have any beliefs about what we are referring to before she learns to speak or think in sentences. And from this it follows, given that baby Jane must have such beliefs if she is to acquire the use of language, that she cannot be taught to use a language, and, indeed, that she never can come to have any beliefs, given Fry's view of the object of belief. Unless we were to assume that humans come into the world already knowing the meanings of words and already knowing which words refer to which things, assumptions that no one, Fry included, will accept, Fry's position leads to the conclusion that no one can ever believe anything. The preceding criticisms of Fry, if sound, show that something is radically wrong with his analysis of belief. Quite apart from what he thinks about deviant cases, Fry surely must think that normal adult human beings do have beliefs, and that the acquisition of linguistic proficiency by children is an everyday occurrence. Not even Fry, that is, can be assumed to accept views that so flagrantly fly in the face of common sense. This being so, Fry must give up his view about the object of belief. In particular, as reflection on the possibility of language acquisition shows, Fry must recognize that human children must have the ability to form beliefs before they learn to use a language, since otherwise they could not learn to use one. More generally, Fry must recognize that there are non-linguistic beliefs. Beliefs, that is, that individuals have independently of their mastery of a language. Before she learns to speak any language, baby Jane must believe enough about what we refer to by our words and gestures to understand what it is that we refer to. This much granted, animals cannot consistently be viewed otherwise. If humans can have non-linguistic beliefs, so can animals. To allow this possibility in the former case while denying it in the latter would be doctrinaire. At this point, if not before, Fry might complain that what he calls a further argument in support of his view that animals cannot believe anything has been systematically ignored. For in order to believe that something is the case, Fry maintains, one must be able to distinguish between true and false beliefs, something that animals are unable to do. Lacking in this respect, they are similarly lacking in beliefs. This further argument is disputable on at least two counts. The first concerns Fry's grounds for denying that animals can distinguish between true and false beliefs. According to Fry, animals are unable to do this because they lack language. But if this is why animals are alleged to lack the ability to distinguish between true and false beliefs, Fry's further argument is not a further argument at all. It assumes that to believe that something is the case, one must believe that this or that sentence is true. Since this is a position of Fry's we have sound reasons to reject, we are similarly entitled to dismiss arguments that would require its acceptance. A second reason for disputing Fry's further argument is this. The view that belief requires one's distinguishing between true and false beliefs leads to an infinite regress. This can be shown by considering what Fry says about our grasp of the connection between language and the world. On Fry's view, we must grasp the relationship between true and false sentences on the one hand, and the world on the other, if we are to believe anything about the world. This grasp is essential. It is, Fry writes, difficult to capture this link. What is certain is that unless we have grasped it, we can have no beliefs about the world. For Fry to say that it is difficult to capture this link is to understate the difficulty for one who holds a view like his. Any credible account of what my grasp of this link involves will involve my having beliefs about how language and the world are linked. To credit me with grasping this link on the one hand, and on the other to deny that I have beliefs about how language and the world are linked, will be irredeemably unintelligible. If I grasp the link, I must have beliefs about the link between the two. That much is certain. Now, these beliefs I have, that is, my beliefs about how language and the world are linked, given Fry's view, inasmuch as they are beliefs, must be beliefs that certain sentences are true. This must be true, given Fry's view, because what one believes, whenever one believes something, is that a given sentence is true. However, if I am to have beliefs about the link between language and the world, I must do in their case what Fry implies I must do in the case of any other belief. I must distinguish between A, my believing that this link is thus and so, and B, my possibly being mistaken in believing what I do. In other words, I must distinguish between my believing that A, a sentence of the form, language and the world are linked in such and such a way is true, and B, language and the world are linked in this way is false. If I fail to grasp the idea that I might be mistaken in believing what I do, then I will have failed to grasp the distinction between true and false beliefs about what I believe is the link between language and the world. And if I fail to grasp this distinction in the case of my beliefs about this link, there is every reason to deny that I have any beliefs about this link, given Fry's views about the concept of belief. But now there is a problem, for if I distinguish between A and B, then I must believe something about the former that I do not believe about the latter. To credit me with grasping the distinction between believing A and believing B on the one hand, and on the other, to deny that I have different beliefs about the two is unintelligible. So in order for me to grasp the link between language and the world, given Fry's views, not only must I have beliefs about the link between the two, I must also have beliefs about my beliefs about the link between the two. And there is no stopping here given a position like Fry's. Since I must distinguish between what I take to be my true beliefs about my beliefs about the link in question, and what I take to be false beliefs about this link, if I am to believe anything about this link, I must also have beliefs about my beliefs about my beliefs about this link, and beliefs about these beliefs, and beliefs about these, and so on ad infinitum. The result is that if I am to grasp the link between language and the world, I must distinguish between an infinite number of beliefs that I take to be true and an infinite number that I take to be false. And since no one can satisfy this requirement, the view that one must grasp the distinction between true and false beliefs in order to grasp the link between language and the world precludes the possibility of anyone's grasping this link, and thus, given Fry's views about the relationship between belief and language, precludes anyone's believing anything about the world. It can be no valid objection to attributing beliefs about the world to animals to urge that they cannot meet a requirement that no one can possibly satisfy. Since Fry's requirement has this unsalutary feature, it provides no good reason against attributing beliefs to animals. There is a way to halt the regress outlined in the preceding paragraph. This is to show that there are some beliefs that we can have that do not require that we distinguish between our belief that they are true and the belief that their negation is false, or, alternatively, between our belief that they are true and our recognizing the possibility that we may be mistaken in believing what we do. For example, suppose it could be shown that in order for any individual, A, to have a belief about the world, A had to distinguish between his believing that something is the case on the one hand and that thing's not being the case on the other. And suppose it was then claimed that although this is necessary in the case of beliefs about the world, it is not necessary in the case of beliefs we have about the relationship between language and the world, or in the case of beliefs about such beliefs, and so forth. If that were shown, then the regress could be stopped, and given a view like Fry's, we could then maintain that animals, because they are languageless, cannot have beliefs about the world. Perhaps this is what Fry believes. In any case, what one would be right to insist upon is a supporting argument. What is there about beliefs about the world that makes it reasonable to require that one distinguish between true and false beliefs in their case, if one is to be said to have such beliefs, but not in the case of any other belief, for example, beliefs about the link between language and the world. Without some argument to support limiting this requirement to just beliefs about the world, limiting it just to these beliefs will be arbitrary in the extreme. Fry, it seems fair to say, fails to advance a supporting argument, and it is extraordinarily unclear what shape any argument could take if, as is required, the charge of arbitrariness is to be met. Setting to one side the criticism that Fry begs the question when he denies that animals are unable to distinguish between true and false beliefs because they lack language, his own views on what is involved in having beliefs about the world either lead to an infinite regress, or, if this regress is stopped at a point that excludes animals from those who have beliefs, does so arbitrarily. In either case, Fry's further argument for denying that animals have beliefs fails. Neither of Fry's arguments examined in the present section provides a reasonable defense of his denial that animals can have beliefs. Neither, therefore, provides an adequate defense of his denial that animals can have desires, if desires presuppose beliefs. The burden of proof the cumulative argument places on those who deny the application of the belief-desire theory to animals has not been met by Fry. 2.3. The content of belief. As was remarked earlier, Fry is not the only one to challenge the application of the belief-desire theory to animals and their behavior. Stitch also believes there is reason to resist applying this theory in their case. But the principal difficulty, according to Stitch, is not, as it is according to Fry, that animals cannot believe anything. It is that we cannot say what they believe, and so cannot describe or explain their behavior by making reference to what they believe and, if beliefs are necessary for desires, by making reference to what they desire. Because Stitch's reasons for denying the validity of applying the belief-desire theory to animals differ from Fry's, their adequacy or inadequacy must be assessed on their merits, independently of the criticisms raised against Fry's arguments. The present section undertakes this necessary assessment. To make his position clearer, Stitch distinguishes between what he calls two quite different sorts of properties that we attribute to beliefs. Here is what he says. On the one hand, we take beliefs to be functional or psychological states of quite a special sort. Beliefs are states which interact with desires, with perception, and with each other. Thus, a psychological model of a subject who has beliefs and desires would have to fit the belief-desire theory. On the other hand, beliefs are states with content. They are propositional attitudes. If a state is a belief, we expect it to be a belief that something or other. We expect there to be some way of expressing its content. Now, the problem about animal belief, what Stitch at one point calls the dilemma of animal belief, is, according to Stitch, that we simply cannot specify the content of what, on the belief-desire theory, we say that animals believe. On reflection, that is, Stitch thinks that we find ourselves quite unable to say what animals believe. And since we are unable to say this, we simply do not know what we are attributing to animals, if and when we say that they believe something. Stitch does not conclude from this that animals do not or cannot have beliefs. He concludes his essay by asking the same question with which he begins, do animals have beliefs? And answers it by writing, to paraphrase my son, a little bit they do, and a little bit they don't. Our interest lies in Stitch's reasons for the little bit they don't part of his answer, with, that is, his arguments that are supposed to show that we cannot specify the content of animal beliefs. Fry, as we shall see, raises similar objections, which also will be considered. In his initial statement of his case, Stitch deploys two different arguments. The first is that since Fido the dog sometimes gets confused when it comes to bones, failing occasionally to recognize that some bones, for example, bones of the middle ear, are bones, while at others he is fooled by imitations, it follows that Fido must not have the concept of a bone. The second argument urges that, even were Fido better at recognizing a bone when he saw one, We still ought not to credit him with understanding the concept of a bone, because he is ignorant of elementary facts about bones, including, for example, that bones have an anatomical function and originate in the way they do. Against both arguments, it is tempting to respond that Fido is not alone in these matters. Many human beings, not just dogs, are fallible when it comes to recognizing bones. And many people once did, and a good many still do, believe that, say, dinosaur bones were part of God's original creation. But though these responses have a point, they fail to address the fundamental assumption Stitch brings to his discussion of animal belief, namely his steady reliance on there being the concept of such and such as the concept of a bone. Unless or until we have examined this assumption, the tempting objections we might want to raise against Stitch's two initial arguments against attributing beliefs to animals might just slide by his position. What then is the concept of a bone, according to Stitch? The answer Stitch provides undermines itself in an interesting way. What Stitch evidently believes, see, for example, his two arguments, is that for any X, the concept of X consists of a set of beliefs about X's. For example, the concept of a bone consists of a set of beliefs about bones, including, say, the beliefs that they have a certain anatomical function and that they originate in a certain way. There is, however, an obvious difficulty for this interpretation of the concept of a bone. What has been and is believed about bones varies considerably, both at the same time but in different places, and in the same places but at different times. To understand the concept of X as consisting of a set of beliefs about X's undermines thinking that there is the concept of anything. To think of concepts in this way is to suggest or assume a permanence in what is believed that history will not tolerate. Rather, we ought at most to speak of the concept of a bone, or of the earth, of the stars, etc., as these are understood by various individuals at the same or different times or places. When, therefore, Stitch writes of the concept of a bone, he must be interpreted to mean not the set of beliefs about bones accepted by everyone who has ever lived, an interpretation that, since there is no unanimity as regards beliefs about bones, or anything else, would cause the concept of a bone to evaporate before our very eyes. He must mean, instead, the set of beliefs about bones shared by those who happen to hold the same beliefs about bones as I do, that is, as Stitch does. Now, since Stitch assumes that his readers are likely to have the same beliefs about bones as he does, and thus to have the same concept of a bone, he might also refer, and in fact sometimes does so refer, to this concept as our concept. Let us assume that we do share Stitch's beliefs. When Stitch refers to the concept of a bone, he means our concept of a bone. And let us briefly note before proceeding how interpreting his talk of the concept of a bone in this way makes it clear how Stitch should reply to the tempting objections, mentioned earlier, concerning his two initial arguments against attributing beliefs to animals. Were we, for example, to object that some humans do not know anything about the anatomical function of bones, and claim that Stitch would be playing favorites if he denied that Fido lacked our concept of a bone because he lacked this belief, but allowed that the humans in question have our concept, Stitch's reply should be clear. It is that neither Fido nor the humans have our concept of a bone. Moreover, since, as Stitch observes, this argument may be reiterated, mutatis mutandis, for meat, yards, burying, and so forth, Stitch will urge that we ought not to attribute these concepts to Fido or to a human who is as irredeemably ignorant as Fido. Stitch, in short, plays no favorites when it comes to who does and who does not have our concepts. Some humans, not just all animals, are losers. The tempting objections to Stitch's initial arguments overlook this and, he implies, therefore pose no real objection. There are two divergent critical approaches one might take at this point. The first is to challenge Stitch by arguing that, though animals and some humans do not have our concept of a bone, or the other family of concepts we share with Stitch. These animals and humans have concepts nonetheless, their concepts, so that it is therefore no serious deficiency in their case that they come up short of the standards one must meet to have our concepts. The second approach is to argue that at least some animals do have our concept of a bone, and if this much could be shown, that they have our concepts of much else besides. The second challenge may seem unpromising, and it is a measure of its initial implausibility that Fry thinks it can be dismissed out of hand. He writes as follows: "If we are to attribute beliefs to animals, then how are we accurately to capture the content of their beliefs? When we say the cat believes that the ball is stuck, do we really wish to maintain that the cat possesses our concepts of ball and stuck? Plainly not. But why is this plainly not the case? Well, Fry goes on to say, the cat does not have our concept of ball, since it is highly unlikely that the cat possesses our notions of physical object or material object or independent thing or substantial entity in my visual field. On Fry's view, as on Stitch's, the reason why the cat plainly lacks our concept of a bone, a ball, or what have you, is that the cat, like any other non-human animal, lacks our beliefs about bones, balls, and so on, or at least it is highly unlikely that these animals have these beliefs. For these reasons, the second challenge one might raise against Stitch, and by implication against Fry in this regard, may seem to be anything but promising. Yet one can imagine how Stitch, like Fry, might argue that it is only this second, not the first challenge that can pose a serious threat. For, since in order to credit animals with beliefs in a full-blooded way, we must be able to specify the content of what they believe, and since in the attempt to specify this we must use a language that encapsulates our concepts, for example, of ball or bone, and assuming that our concept of a bone includes, say, the beliefs that bones have certain anatomical functions and originate in certain ways, beliefs we have no reason to assume that animals share, then it looks fairly certain that no animal can have our concept of a bone or of anything. This being so, to persist in attributing beliefs to animals, beliefs that involve their supposed concepts, as those who would criticize Stitch's position in the first way are wont to do, seems illogical at best. To use Fry's observation about the cat who, though presumably lacking our concepts of ball and stuck, is nevertheless alleged to believe that the ball is stuck, what this first approach would leave us with are supposed feline concepts, though without any idea as to what these are or how they are formed. This first critical approach to Stitch's views, therefore, seems destined to fail to do what it set out to do, namely to specify the content of animal beliefs. This can be done, Stitch could argue, only if we had reason to believe that animals share our concepts. And this can be argued not by attempting to challenge Stitch's position along the lines of the first critical approach, but only by pressing the second. It is not certain that Stitch would reply in just these terms, but it is certain that he could. In any event, it is the second way of critically approaching Stitch's views on animal beliefs, and as we shall see more clearly, Fry's as well, that will be pursued in what follows. Before commencing my critical assessment, a cautionary word is in order. As in any other controversial areas in philosophy, there is no scarcity of alternative views in the particular case of the analysis of the concept of concepts. It will not be possible to examine all the competing alternatives, but neither would it be fair to require that we do so. The motivation of the present discussion is to examine the merits of major arguments that explicitly address the question of animal beliefs and desires. And though there are other positions regarding the concept of concepts that have interesting implications for this question, it is not unreasonable to limit the scope of our inquiry here to an assessment of the major arguments at hand, namely to Stitch's and, as we shall see, Fry's. To try to do more would be to accomplish less. One final preliminary point. In contesting the views of those who deny that we can say what animals believe even if we assume that they believe something, one can either accept the type of analysis of the concept of concepts on which these views depend, or reject this analysis. To do the latter is certain to meet with objections from Stitch and Fry, and the debate over whose analysis of the concept of concepts is the right one is, it seems, certain to carry us further away from the question that inspires the controversy presently before us, namely, whether we can say what animals believe, assuming that they have beliefs. Better, then, for present purposes, to grant to these critics the type of analysis they themselves rely upon, and then to show that even if we concede this much, it does not follow that we cannot say what animals believe. This may be to concede more to these critics than we should, but to concede less, it seems, would be certain to be counterproductive. The concept of concepts. Among the questions we need to consider is the following. Suppose there are two groups of individuals, G1 and G2, who do not share all of the same beliefs about a given X, for example, about bones. Is this difference by itself sufficient for concluding that they do not have the same concept of a bone? It would be sufficient if we accept what we might call the all-or-nothing view of concepts and their acquisition. On this view, any difference in the beliefs held about X's as between G1 and G2 is enough to rule out their having the same concept. For example, if the Stitchians, those of us who believe all that Stitch believes about bones, believe all that we do, while the pre-chemists believe all that we do except that because of their ignorance of chemistry they do not believe that bones contain calcium, then, on the all-or-nothing view, we Stitchians have one concept of a bone, while the pre-chemists have an entirely different one. An alternative to the all-or-nothing view is the more or less view. This view holds that having a given concept is not the you either have it or you lack it situation the all-or-nothing view entails. On the more or less view, different groups and different individuals can have the same concept to a greater or lesser degree. On this view, the pre-chemists have the Stitchian, our concept of a bone, though not in toto, and another group similarly lacking in chemical knowledge, but also in the dark about how, say, dinosaur bones originated, also has our concept of a bone, but to an even less degree than the pre-chemists. Who has what concept, in short, is a matter of degree according to the more or less view. It bears noting, however, that even the more or less view will allow us sometimes to say that a given group or individual completely lacks a given concept of ours. For example, if the boneheads believed that bones came into existence by a sort of magical spontaneous generation when and only when a living body was injured or died, and explicitly denied that bones have the anatomical function we Stitchians affirm, denied that bones originated in the way we believe, and similarly denied everything else that we take to be definitive of a bone, then, even if we accept the more or less view, we ought to say that the boneheads lack our concept of a bone, totally. We shall return to the case of the boneheads later. For the present, there is a more fundamental issue to decide. The all-or-nothing and the more or less views give us two different ways of regarding, two alternative ways of describing what is involved in possessing the same concept. Assuming that one's concept of X is one's set of beliefs about X's, which view ought rationally to be preferred? The more or less view seems clearly rationally preferable. Not only does it enable us to mark the difference we want to mark between the pre-chemists and the boneheads, vis-a-vis their having our concept of a bone, for we do want to say that the pre-chemists and the boneheads are not equally deficient when it comes to their respective possession of our concept. It also enables us to explain how it is possible for individuals to increase their understanding of a given concept in stages, incrementally, a little at a time. This is a possibility the more or less view allows and the all-or-nothing view excludes. Suppose, for illustrative purposes, that Mitch has a quite limited understanding of what it is to be a bone, making all the errors a beginner is prone to make, taking a long time to hear the difference between, say, bone and phone, with predictable attendant mistakes. From these meager beginnings, imagine Mitch has progressed and now knows a good deal about bones, though still not an expert by any means, and still woefully ignorant when it comes to matters chemical. It would be very natural to say that Mitch's understanding of the Stitchian, concept of a bone had progressed, from very little to a good deal more, that his grasp of this concept had improved. The more or less view can account for this, but the all-or-nothing view cannot. On this latter view, Mitch did not start with a limited understanding of our concept of a bone and then come steadily to increase his understanding of this concept as he learned more about what we believe about bones. According to the all-or-nothing view, when Mitch had only a few of our beliefs about bones, he did not have our concept at all, because he did not as yet have all the beliefs about bones that, on the all-or-nothing view, he must have in order to have our concept in the first place. Nor did Mitch add to his understanding of our concept as he acquired additional beliefs we have about bones. Rather, just as he was totally lacking in our concept when he had only a few of our beliefs about bones, so he failed to increase his grasp of our concept as he acquired additional beliefs. With every increase, Mitch acquired a different concept. It was only on that fateful day when, let us assume, Mitch came to have all the beliefs about bones that, on the all-or-nothing view, one must have in order to have our concept of a bone, that Mitch acquired his first grasp of our concept. On that fateful day, in short, the all-or-nothing view entails that Mitch went from having nothing, that is, from having no grasp of our concept of a bone, to having everything, that is, to having our concept completely. It is difficult to understand how, unless, to use a wonderful expression of Fry's, one is in the grip of a theory, anyone could claim that the all-or-nothing view is a credible view about concepts and their acquisition. Mitch clearly has made some sort of progress before he arrives at that banner day when he completes the list of our beliefs about bones. Toward the end of his adventure in learning, Mitch clearly is closer to completing his grasp of our concept of a bone, not closer to acquiring our concept to any extent for the first time. If it is the beliefs we have about bones that define our concept of a bone, the reasonable thing to say is that Mitch has increased his understanding of our concept along the way. The more or less view will countenance our saying this, but the all-or-nothing view will not. Since, then, one wants an account of concepts and concept acquisition that enables us to say this, there are principled reasons for selecting the more or less view in preference to its rival. Asking the right question. Now, acceptance of the more or less view enables us to give a clear formulation of the question we need to answer if we are to attribute our concept of a bone to Fido. For if individuals can have this concept to a greater or lesser degree, the possibility presents itself that it would be enough to show that Fido has this concept if we had reason to maintain that he had just one of the beliefs among the set of beliefs that defines our concept. Granted, were Fido to have just one such belief, his understanding of this concept would be meager, impoverished, elementary, and so on, in comparison to those who have this concept in toto. But this would only show that his understanding was less than others, not that he has no understanding at all. The question we need to ask, then, granting the reasonableness of the more or less view, is this. Is there any reason to maintain that Fido has at least one of the beliefs about bones that is definitive of our concept of a bone? It would seem not. The two most obvious attempts to provide an affirmative answer prove woefully ineffective. The first attempt begins by noting that, though not infallible, Fido nonetheless is reasonably good at discriminating when it comes to bones. Normally, that is, Fido knows a bone when he sees one. Might we not conclude from his success in this regard that he therefore has our concept of a bone, at least minimally? The answer must be no. For though Fido is good when it comes to recognizing a bone when he sees one, his success in this regard does not, by itself, tell us anything about his concept of a bone. Does not, that is, by itself, inform us about what it is for something to be a bone from Fido's point of view. Let his powers of discrimination be as good as you please. We are still as far from saying what Fido believes when he believes that something is a bone as we were before. Even assuming that the more or less view of concepts and concept acquisition is to be preferred, and even granting that Fido is a skillful bone discriminator, we have as yet no reason to maintain that Fido has our concept of a bone, even to a minimum degree. A natural response to the failure of this first argument is to attempt to determine the properties of those bones Fido recognizes as bones. This could be approached in a scientific manner. Bones could be weighed and chemically analyzed, and shapes could be recorded. We would then, let us assume, eventually arrive at a sort of Fido bone profile, a report that sets forth the chemical, geometric, and other properties of bones Fido recognizes, as against bones Fido doesn't recognize. However, even were we to achieve our objective, this would not provide a basis for attributing any part of our concept of a bone to Fido, since, as Stitch argues against a comparable enterprise, we cannot view Fido's concept of a bone in terms of the dog's beliefs about the chemical, geometric, and other theory-laden properties we find in the bones Fido recognizes. This we could not do because there is no good reason to believe, and profoundly good reason to deny, that Fido himself understands anything whatever about chemistry, geometry, and the other factors that figure in his bone profile. What Stitch calls the dilemma of animal belief, then, comes to this. Fido's ability to recognize a bone when he sees one, by itself, does not reveal what it is that Fido believes are the properties of bones by virtue of which he recognizes those bones he does. And our efforts to say what these properties are, it seems, can only supply us with a list of properties there is no reason to suppose that Fido can understand, let alone believe, that bones possess. Neither of these approaches, in short, can move us any closer to the goal of specifying the content of what Fido believes when he believes that something is a bone. Now, later on, the point will be made that our ignorance regarding Fido's beliefs about the properties bones have is a two-edged sword, and we shall want to explain how sharp its second edge is. For the present, it may look as if there is no possible way to specify the content of Fido's beliefs about bones, and thus no possible ground on which to attribute our concept of a bone to the dog. Enfranchising Fido. Though the most obvious efforts to enfranchise Fido in this respect fail for the reasons given, to conclude that Fido cannot share any belief about bones with us would be premature, for there is a belief about bones that, 1, is a member of the set of beliefs that defines our concept of bones, and that, 2, we have ample reason to maintain that Fido has. The belief in question does not concern some theory-laden property of bones, such as their chemical composition, nor is the belief reducible to Fido's discriminatory capacity when it comes to bones. Rather, the belief concerns how bones relate to desires and their satisfaction, more particularly how, in certain circumstances, the choice of a bone is the preferred choice, that is the choice to be made if a desire is to be satisfied. To make this clearer, we need first to remind ourselves that occasions arise in the sphere of human activity where the choice of a bone is the choice to be made if we are to satisfy certain desires or fulfill certain purposes. What these desires or purposes are can vary from, say, wanting to illustrate how a bone decays over time to desiring to concoct a hearty beef stew. Nevertheless, bones being what they are, circumstances do arise where, given that we have those desires and purposes we have, The selection of a bone is called for if we are to satisfy these desires or fulfill these purposes. Now, to recognize this connection between bones and satisfying desire is to have a belief about bone. Not, to be sure, a belief about their chemical composition or their anatomical function, but a belief about bones nonetheless. Moreover, this belief, the belief that a bone is to be chosen if a given desire is to be satisfied, is one member of the set of beliefs that collectively define our concept. This can be seen by imagining that Mitch has progressed in his understanding of this concept to the point where he understands that bones have an anatomical function, but when asked what to add to the pot, a meaty beef bone or a maple limb, given his keen desire for a tasty beef stew, he replies that he does not know which should be added and disclaims any understanding of there being any connection between the taste of stews and the flavor of bones. If Mitch were to display so grievous a lack of understanding of this connection, we would be right to say not that he has no grasp of our concept of a bone, but that he has not quite got the whole of that concept. He simply fails to grasp the connection between the flavor bones have on the one hand, and on the other, how this fact bears on why, in circumstances of a sort in which he finds himself, bones are to be chosen in preference to other things if he is to satisfy the desire we assume he has. Put another way, the belief that is grounded in one's understanding of this connection, let us call this the preference belief, is, to this point in time at least, missing from Mitch's repertoire of beliefs concerning bones. But what of Fido? Does he have the preference belief Mitch lacks? Does he believe that there is a connection between A, satisfying his desire for a certain flavor, and B, choosing a bone? Lacking as he is in knowledge, Fido, of course, cannot tell us, or reasonably be expected to tell us, whether he has this belief. In the nature of the case, his having the preference belief Mitch lacks can be fairly judged by attending to the only thing we have to go on, namely his nonverbal behavior. What we want to ask, then, is whether, by observing Fido's behavior, we may ever reasonably conclude that he believes that bones are to be chosen if he is to satisfy his desire for a certain flavor. Recall, before an answer to this question is offered, that representative arguments that deny that animals can believe or desire anything were examined and found wanting in the previous section. Thus, those who, for example, are enamored of a stimulus-response explanation of animal behavior cannot rely on those arguments to support their view that Fido in particular and animals in general neither believe nor desire anything. Once the question is put in the appropriate terms, and once we command a clear view of the conceptual and empirical terrain from the vantage point of the argument that has progressed to this point, the answer is clear. All indications are that Fido does, from time to time, desire a flavor he finds that bones have. This is, on the view recommended here, a fact about Fido, something we know of him, not wild speculation or unbridled anthropomorphism. These claims are defended more fully in Section 2.4. Moreover, we can also observe, by attending to how he behaves, what Fido selects by way of fulfilling his desire. This is not the refrigerator, say, or the neighbor's lawnmower. What he selects by way of fulfilling his desire is a bone. On the basis of his behavior, therefore, we have reason to maintain that Fido believes that bones are related to his desires or preferences in the following way. Bones satisfy certain desires he has and are to be chosen to satisfy those desires. Granted, our accepting that Fido has this one belief about bones does not settle the question about the full range of properties bones have, from Fido's point of view, by virtue of which he recognizes a bone when he sees one. There may be, and indeed most certainly probably are many such properties, including, most obviously, certain olfactory properties that Fido associates with being a bone. But what these properties are, however interesting that question may be, is not a question that must be answered before we can credit Fido with believing that there is a connection between choosing bones and satisfying his desire for the flavor they have. Whatever the full range of these properties might be, we have ample reason to maintain, on the basis of how the dog behaves, when viewed against the backdrop of the cumulative argument, that Fido sometimes chooses a bone in the belief that it will satisfy his desire for a given flavor. And to know this of Fido is to know enough for present purposes, since knowing this much, we can say something specific about what Fido believes about bones. We can, that is, specify the content of his concept of a bone, at least to some degree. When Fido believes that something is a bone, at least part of what he believes is that it will satisfy his desire for a particular flavor, and so is to be chosen if that desire is to be satisfied. Now, it is not irrelevant that Fido should have this belief about bones. On the contrary, as was already noted, the preference belief is part of our concept of a bone. For if Mitch uniformly fails to recognize that bones being what they are, and his desires being what we have imagined them to be, a bone is to be chosen if he is to satisfy his desire for a particular flavor, then Mitch simply hasn't quite grasped our concept of a bone. Given, however, that Fido has the preference belief about bones that Mitch lacks, given further that this belief is one of the beliefs that define the content of our concept of a bone, and given, finally, the reasonableness of the more or less view of concepts and their acquisition, then it follows that Fido does have our concept of a bone, at least to some degree. What Fry maintains is plainly not the case regarding our attributions of beliefs to animals, namely that it is plainly not the case that animals have our concepts of anything, turns out to be otherwise, even if not plainly. Though his grasp may be limited, Fido has our concept of a bone, assuming, as we have, that our concept of X is understood as our beliefs about X's. 2.4. 3 objections. A number of objections can be anticipated, one each concerning, respectively, what concepts, what experiences, and what beliefs we are entitled to say Fido has. Each will be considered separately in the order just given. When we reach the third, we will be able to supplement the previous remarks about Fido's grasp of the preference belief. Lacking beliefs and lacking concepts. First, it might be objected that Fido's possessing, at least so far as has been argued in the above, only one of the beliefs that define our concept of a bone is an insufficient basis on which to attribute our concept to him, even assuming the more or less view is rationally preferable. Certainly, Stitch is likely to make this objection, since he states at one point that if a subject lacks enough of our beliefs, content attribution is undermined. This position, however, rests on a failure to distinguish between two senses in which a subject may be said to lack enough of our beliefs. The first is what we might term the denial sense, the sense in which the boneheads, as discussed earlier, lack enough of the beliefs about bones we Stitchians accept. For the boneheads, it will be recalled, deny all the beliefs we Stitchians affirm when it comes to bones. They certainly lack enough of our beliefs about bones and do not, therefore, have our concept. A second sense of lack enough beliefs is the non-denial sense. In this sense, a subject who lacks our beliefs does not deny any of them. Rather, the subject simply does not have the beliefs in question. Mitch, for example, in the early stages of his education in our concept of a bone, certainly lacks a great many of our beliefs about bones, but does not deny any of these remaining beliefs. Unlike the boneheads, Mitch does not deny that bones have the anatomical function we believe they have. The matter of bones having or not having an anatomical function is an idea yet to be broached in Mitch's early education. While it is true that we ought not to attribute our concept of a bone to the boneheads because they lack enough of our beliefs about bones in the denial sense, it by no means follows that we should do the same in Mitch's case. Indeed, Given the reasonableness of the more or less view, we have principled reasons for maintaining that Mitch does have our concept to a limited degree, even though he lacks many of the beliefs definitive of that concept, in the non-denial sense of lacks our beliefs. So long as Mitch has at least one of the beliefs definitive of our concept, and so long as we have no reason to suppose that he holds other beliefs about bones that either explicitly deny our other beliefs or entail their denial, there is sufficient reason to attribute our concept to him. To object that we cannot attribute our concept of a bone to Fido because Fido lacks enough of our beliefs about bones can be a valid objection, given what has just been argued, only if we have reason to believe that Fido lacks enough of our beliefs in the denial sense. That is, we cannot deny that Fido has our concept unless we have reason to suppose that Fido has other beliefs about bones, in addition to the preference belief, that explicitly deny our remaining beliefs or entail their denial. So let us ask whether we have ample reason to believe this of Fido. It is here that the second, the neglected edge of our claimed ignorance about the remaining beliefs Fido has about bones shows itself. For our ignorance is genuine if Stitch is correct. As remarked earlier, Fido's success at recognizing bones does not by itself reveal what those properties are, by virtue of which he recognizes a bone when he sees one, and our attempts to discover what these properties are by our own devices can only give us a list of properties, for example, chemical and geometric, which there is no reason to suppose that Fido can understand, let alone believe bones have. But our presumed ignorance in this regard, if genuine, shows that we cannot be justified in maintaining that Fido, though he has the preference belief, lacks our remaining beliefs about bones in the denial sense of lacks. Since we do not know what other beliefs Fido has about bones, given Stitch's view, we do not know that any or all of these beliefs explicitly or implicitly deny our remaining beliefs. And since we do not know this, we have no reason to deny that Fido has this concept, assuming, as always, that Fido does have the preference belief, that this belief is partially definitive of our concept of a bone, and that the more or less view of concepts and concept acquisition is accepted. Were we to accept all this and still maintain that Mitch does, while Fido does not have our concept of a bone, then we would be playing favorites, and this in a rather nakedly prejudicial way. It might be thought that this charge of prejudice could be met if an argument was at hand that showed that the beliefs defining our concept of a bone themselves have varying logical properties. In particular, suppose it is claimed that having the anatomical belief about bones is a logically necessary condition of having our concept of a bone. If this were shown to be so, then one could see how Fido would lack our concept of a bone, even though he shared at least one belief about bones with us. Moreover, since logic plays no favorites, it might seem that Fido has been excluded non-arbitrarily. But has he? One would want to know precisely how we are supposed to arrive at the conclusion that having the anatomical belief is a necessary condition of having our concept of a bone. If we were told that this is so because Fido cannot have this belief, then the prejudicial basis on which the issue is being decided would be obvious. Once we deny the reintroduction of the very prejudice under suspicion, however, there can be no argument that could convert anyone not already committed to the conclusion that the anatomical belief is necessary. If it were, then we would be obliged to say that Mitch did not have our concept of a bone, no matter how many other beliefs about bones he shared with us, if he lacked this particular belief. For reasons already adduced, this is an unsatisfactory view in the particular case of the anatomical belief. What is true of the anatomical belief may be true of any other belief about bones. Given any particular belief we have about bones, that is, it may be true that having that particular belief is not a necessary condition of having our concept of a bone, at least to a certain degree. What is true of the anatomical belief, however, may not be true of every other belief we have about bones. There remains, that is, the possibility that at least one belief we have about bones is necessary, is essential, if someone is to have our concept. But what belief, if any, might this be? If there is such a belief, none can have a greater claim to the title essential belief than the preference belief. After all, the question about who has our concept of a bone arises within the larger context of discussions about the belief-desire theory. So again, if there is one belief about bones that is essential for possessing our concept, that belief should concern the relationship between believing that something is a bone on the one hand, and on the other, the bearing that having this belief has on choosing that thing, that is, the thing believed to be a bone, to satisfy a given desire. And that is precisely what characterizes the preference belief, since to have that belief is to believe that those things one believes are bones are to be chosen in preference to other things, if one is to satisfy one's desire for a particular taste or flavor. Accordingly, if there is no belief about bones that is essential for having our concept of a bone, then Fido cannot be disenfranchised from having our concept on the grounds that he shares only one belief, the preference belief, with us. Whereas, if there is some one belief that is essential for possessing our concept of a bone, the preference belief has at least as strong a claim to that title as any other belief. Whichever alternative is chosen, we have rational grounds to attribute a grasp of our concept of a bone to Fido. Fido is no bonehead when it comes to bones. Animal experience. A second objection holds that if we knew what it would be like to have a desire or taste a bone in the way Fido does, then we could attribute the preference belief to the dog, and thereby give content to what he believes when he believes that something is a bone. In fact, however, we do not know what it is like for Fido to experience anything, which rules out attributing the preference belief to him. Aside from discredited Cartesian grounds for denying consciousness to animals, what could be the basis for the skepticism that infuses this objection? One possibility is that since Fido is not a language user, and since our own attempts to describe his experience necessarily will be expressed in language, it follows that we cannot know what it would be like for Fido to experience desires, tastes, and the like. Let us call this the language argument. It is a specious argument. Were we to accept it, we would be committed to the view that language users cannot know that any description of anything that lacks a language is true. When, for example, we say a penny is brown, we, who are language users, offer a partial description of the coin, which is not a language user. If it were claimed that we cannot know what it would be like for Fido to experience desires and the like, because our descriptions are linguistic and the dog is not a language user, then we should also have to say that we cannot know that the penny is brown because it, too, lacks language. But this is absurd. Equally absurd, therefore, is the view that leads to it. It cannot be reasonable to be skeptical of what we know about Fido's experience because we do, while he does not, use a language. To give a slight twist to an argument of Jonathan Bennett's, a philosopher at Syracuse University, if we could not know anything about canine experience because we use language and dogs don't, then we could not even give a knowledgeable description of the canine digestive system. Perhaps it will be replied that it is the limits of our imagination, not language, that blocks the way to our being able to understand what it would be like for Fido to experience desires and the like. We cannot, we might be told, put ourselves imaginatively into Fido's world, cannot experience the world as Fido does. All efforts to do so are doomed since, even were we to imagine ourselves looking out at the world through the dog's eyes, so to speak, all we will have succeeded in doing is imagining ourselves looking out through his eyes, not Fido's doing so. Because we lack the necessary imaginative wherewithal, we just can't understand what it would be like for Fido to experience things as he does. This argument, the imagination argument, also has skeptical implications few could live with. If I cannot imagine what it would be like to taste something as Fido does, because all I can possibly bring off is imagining myself tasting things while imaginatively inhabiting Fido's body, how could it be any different were I to try to imagine myself being, say, Fidel Castro? Let my imaginative efforts and success be as robust as you please, I am still not going to have Fidel's experiences. At most, I will have experiences of mine that I take to be like those of the Cuban leader. Am I to say that I therefore do not know what it is like for Fidel to want a cigar or to taste some brandy? I must say this if my knowledge of how he experiences things stands or falls on my ability to imagine my being him to such a degree that what I experience are his experiences. But of course we do not suppose that skepticism should be given so free a rein. We do not believe that we are obliged to say that we do not know something because we are unable to fulfill a requirement for knowledge that it is impossible to fulfill. It cannot be reasonable, therefore, to be skeptical about how Fidel experiences desires, tastes, and so on, because we cannot imagine his experiences as ours. Neither, then, can it be reasonable to be skeptical about Fido's experiences on similar grounds. Still, someone will protest, and here we come to the species argument. Fidel's and Fido's cases are different. Granted, I cannot experience Fidel's desires, only my own. Nevertheless, I know enough about what it is to be a human being. I have a first-hand acquaintance, after all, that I know that, when Fidel wants a cigar, his experience is like mine when, say, I want a pinch of snuff. The case of Fido is markedly different. I share no common fund of experience with the dog and thus do not know how he experiences anything. Fido is a dog, not, like Fidel, a member of my own species. But is it true that different individuals, because they belong to different species, do not share any common experience? We would be in a fine fix, both practically and theoretically, if it were so. No one, presumably, believes that because dogs and cats belong to different species, that they therefore share no common experience. For example, that canine and feline pain or canine and feline sexual desires are entirely different phenomena. Granted, it is logically possible that, though these animals exhibit similar pain and sexual behavior, they nonetheless have entirely different accompanying mental states. Both our common practice and respect for parsimony, however, are against regarding this possibility as true. Not only do we behave in ways that attest to our belief that animals from different species have similar experiences. For example, we act as if cat and dog pain are the same or relevantly similar. And not only does our behaving in this way work, treating cats and dogs as if they had the same or similar experiences enables us to interact with them in a practically efficacious way, as when, for example, we offer efficacious medical treatment to a cat with a broken leg that is analogous to the efficacious treatment we give a dog. More than this, regarding canine and feline experience as relevantly similar also has sound theory on its side. For we ought not to multiply kinds of experience, canine, feline, etc., beyond necessity. If the belief that animals from different species share common or relevantly similar experiences is consistent with their observed behavior, then it is reasonable, for reasons of parsimony, to accept this belief. The belief that animals from different species do have the same or relevantly similar experiences frequently is consistent with their observed behavior, which is why, in addition to our having practical reasons for accepting this belief, we have theoretical reasons besides. We would throw respect for simplicity to the wind if we thought otherwise. But is the attribution of common experiences to humans and animals consistent with human and animal behavior? This is a question to be settled on the basis of observing how humans and animals behave. What we want to know is whether animals ever behave in ways that resemble how humans behave, when we know that humans, say, desire water, warmth, food, or rest. Given the other tenets of the cumulative argument, and setting skeptical doubts about our knowledge of other minds to one side. It can only be, in Hume's words, in A Treatise Concerning Human Nature, from the resemblance of the external actions of animals to those we ourselves perform, that we can judge their internal likewise to resemble ours. If their behavior does resemble ours, and given the other tenets of the cumulative argument, then simplicity again will be on the side of attributing shared experiences. Now, none will deny that animal behavior does resemble human behavior when, for example, it comes to the behavior associated with the known human desires just mentioned. If I know that you are thirsty and desire some water, I naturally expect you to drink a glass of water rather than down a cup of sand when given the choice. Human thirst behavior has its animal counterpart, and so I expect that animals would make a similar selection. In claiming that human thirst or taste, etc., experience and animal thirst or taste, etc., experience are similar, what we claim is not inconsistent with the observable facts about human and animal behavior. Once again, therefore, since on grounds of simplicity, I ought not to multiply kinds of experience beyond necessity. I ought not to postulate a human taste experience, say, that is totally different from canine taste experience. On the contrary, I ought to postulate a shared, a common taste experience, even though dogs belong to one species of animals and humans to another. This is not to say, and one need not say this, that every human experience has its animal counterpart, or even that every animal experience always is relevantly similar to some human experience. It is not to say the former because, for example, there is no reason to suppose that Fido has anything like the political worries I have, or delights in Steeler victories as I do. And it is not to say the latter because there may be some forms of animal experience so alien to our own that we not only do not share relevantly similar experiences with them, we may not even be able to understand what it would be like to do so. This latter point is forcefully made by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel in his provocative essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? We know, observes Nagel, that most bats, the Microchiroptera to be precise, perceive the external world primarily by sonar or echolocation, detecting the reflections from objects within range of their own rapid, subtly modulated high-frequency shrieks. Their brains are designed to correlate the outgoing impulses with the subsequent echoes, and the information thus acquired enables bats to make precise discriminations of distance, size, shape, motion, and texture comparable to those we make by vision. But bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there is no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. The question at hand, however, is not whether some animals have some experiences radically dissimilar from human experience. That may be conceded by all the parties to the dispute. The question is whether we have any reason to believe that any animals have any experiences relevantly similar to some human experiences, most especially whether any, including Fido, experience desires and tastes in a way similar to how we do. Because the relevant animal behavior resembles human behavior, because we have independent reasons for viewing animals like Fido as having a mental life, and because simplicity requires that we not multiply kinds of experience beyond necessity, there is a strong presumptive reason for viewing these animal experiences as being like their human counterparts. It is a strong presumptive reason because we allow that arguments may be forthcoming that show that the inference to similar mental states is unwarranted. For example, because, in some cases, human and animal behavior is not sufficiently similar. 3 arguments that, if sound, would block this inference have been considered: the language argument, the imagination argument, and the species argument. Each has been found wanting. There may, of course, be other arguments. Unless or until some argument is given that shows that this inference is rationally defective, however, the similarity of behavior between conscious beings from different species, coupled with the other tenets of the cumulative argument, warrant making it. Behavior and the content of belief. A final objection concerns our ability to specify the content of animal belief on the basis of animal behavior. The point at issue is not whether animal behavior by itself suffices as a basis on which to rest the claim that animals have beliefs, understood as functional or psychological states. Earlier discussions have argued that the attribution of a mental life to animals rests on considerations in addition to how they behave. For example, on considerations about the ordinary use of such words as wants, believes, hates, etc., as well as on the implications of evolutionary theory. The point presently at issue concerns our alleged inability to say what animals believe, to specify the content of their beliefs on the basis of their observed behavior. Stitch, because he denies that we can specify the content of animal beliefs, implies that we cannot say what they believe on the basis of how they behave. Stitch's grounds for his denial have been considered and disputed. Fry also addresses the question at issue and offers a negative answer. Even if we were to suppose that animals have beliefs, that is, beliefs in the sense of functional or psychological states, Fry claims that we could not say what animals believe on the basis of how they behave. His reasons for this denial are set forth in the following passage. I do not understand how behavior can show that my dog possesses the belief that P, unless that behavior is connected with the belief that P, in such a way that same behavior is not compatible with the belief that Q or that R or that S. For if the dog's behavior is compatible both with the belief that P and with these other beliefs, then I do not understand how it can be concluded on the basis of that behavior that it is the belief that P that the dog has. For example, several months ago my dog wagged its tail furiously when its master was at the door, but also when its lunch was about to be served and when the sun was being eclipsed by the moon. So far as I could see, its behavior was the same on the last two occasions as it was on the first, and I am not at all clear how, on the basis of that behavior, it can be concluded that it was the belief that his master was at the door which the dog had. A number of questions arise here, the most important being whether Frey has a sufficiently rich understanding of behavior, especially as this bears on the behavioral grounds for the attribution of particular beliefs, in his dog's case or in any other. Suppose Mary, a human, hears a noise and we observe her walk to the door. Can we rationally attribute any particular belief to her concerning who or what she believes is at the door, just on the basis of her going toward it? Our answer must be that we clearly cannot. But this is not because we know all we would want to know about her behavior and still find ourselves rationally unable to say what Mary believes. It is, rather, that we cannot understand individual bits of behavior in isolation from the broader context in which they take place, either now, in the past, or in the future. Abstracted from its contextual home, Mary's going to the door behavior hardly constitutes behavior at all. It is little more than a series of movements in a certain direction. But to what end? Was the noise a familiar noise? Was she expecting someone? Does she hesitate before opening the door? These are the sorts of questions one would have to have answered before one could rationally begin to say who or what Mary believes is at the door. We need what might be termed a holistic view of behavior, not an atomistic view, if we are to make reasonable attributions of particular beliefs on the basis of how individuals behave, not only in the case of animals, as shall shortly be explained, but also in the case of humans. Fry's dog, we are told, wags his tail furiously under quite different circumstances, not only when Fry is at the door. That being so, Fry wants to know how the tail wagging can show that Fido believes that Fry is at the door. But this is to ask an improper question, not only in Fido's case, but in any case. Behavior must be understood in context, holistically, if it is to be understood at all. When we say that the dog believes Fry is at the door, we imply that the dog has certain expectations. Expectations which, if the dog has them, will be manifested by the dog's future behavior. If the dog has this belief, then he expects a certain person to enter, one with whom, let us suppose, he has an amiable relationship, and thus one the dog looks forward to seeing with pleasurable anticipation. The attribution of this belief to Fido can only be understood in terms of our having reason to believe that the dog has these expectations, and our having reason to believe this can only come from our past observation of how the dog behaves, or how other dogs like Fido behave, in relevantly similar circumstances. When, for example, there is a familiar sound on the stairs or at the door, for we can no more say with reason who or what Fido believes is at the door without this sort of background information than we can with reason say who or what Mary believes is at the door if we are similarly ignorant. Let us assume we know the dog well, and so interpret his tail wagging when there is a familiar sound of his friend in the air. It is not the tail wagging alone, considered in isolation from everything else under the sun, that serves as the basis for attributing the belief to Fido that Fry is at the door. It is the known association between his wagging his tail, given relevantly similar circumstances, and his having shown by his past behavior in such circumstances that he has certain expectations associated with his friends being at the door, that provides the grounds for our attributing this belief to him now. We are right to attribute this belief to him if we have reason to believe that he now has those expectations he would have if he believes that it is his friend, just as we would be right to attribute to Mary the belief that her friend Nora is at the door if we have reason to believe that she has those expectations she would have if she believed it was her friend at the door. But just as we cannot say that Mary believes this solely on the basis of her walking to the door when a noise has been heard, so we cannot say what Fido believes just by viewing his tail wagging as a piece of isolated behavior. This account of the behavioral basis on which to attribute particular beliefs to animals gains additional support when we recognize three further points. First, the account recommended here provides us with a way to test the accuracy of belief attributions. Since we imply that Fido has certain identifiable expectations when we attribute to him the belief that Fry is at the door, the attribution of this belief will be shown to be accurate, verified, confirmed, if, by his future behavior, Fido shows that he had those expectations he would have if he believed that it was his friend who was at the door. If he displays his recognition of Fry, shows his excitement at his return, and, say, engages in other customary ritual greeting behavior, then we have all the reason we could have, and all that we should be required to have, to say that he did believe that it was his friend at the door. For this is just the way Fido would behave if he expected Fry, and he would expect Fry if he believed that it was Fry at the door. If, however, he greets the entering person with snaps, growls, barks, and a bite or two, we have all the reason we could have, and all the reason we should be expected to have, to conclude that he did not believe it was Fry who was at the door. Unless there is more than a little antagonism between Fry and his dog, this is not the way the dog would behave if he thought Fry was about to enter. In either case, it is how the dog behaves, not only before but after someone enters through the door, that will determine whether our attribution is accurate. His pre-entrance behavior gives us a sign as to what his beliefs, and thus, what his expectations are, but his post-entrance behavior provides the crucial test for determining whether we have read the signs accurately. Second, this same account of attributions of particular beliefs to animals illuminates what it means to say, and how to test the accuracy of, the attribution of beliefs to animals in intentional contexts. Let us say that animals behave intentionally whenever they do one thing in order that they may do another. For example, if Fido scratches at the door, is let out, immediately runs to the spot where he saw us burying something and begins to dig furiously, his behavior looks for all the world like intentional behavior. He wants out in order to get to the burial spot, and he digs there in order to find what was buried. It would be natural to say that Fido behaved as he did because he had certain beliefs. For example, the belief that a bone was to be found and that he had to get out and dig to find it. Is it reasonable to attribute such intentional beliefs to the dog? It is if we have reason to believe that the dog has those expectations he would have if he has the beliefs we attribute to him. And our attribution will be reasonable if, on the basis of our past observations of the dog's behavior, we have come to recognize that he behaves in certain ways in relevantly similar circumstances, and thus displays that he has relevantly similar expectations. The accuracy of our attribution also is testable by observing how the dog actually behaves. If it is a Coke bottle we have buried in the yard, and if Fido is a normal dog, he will behave quite differently when he unearths it than he would have behaved had he found a bone, and it will not take a trained ethologist's eye to note the difference. Were he to find the bottle while expecting a bone, he would behave as anyone would whose expectations had been dashed. If Fido is a normal dog, his disappointment will be evident. His behavior will be what we would expect or predict it to be if he discovered that his belief, there is a bone, were false, so that we may, in the absence of a sound argument against this, and Fry's denial to the contrary notwithstanding, credit Fido and similar animals with the ability to distinguish between true and false beliefs. Third, because of the general features of the account of the grounds for attributing and testing the attributions of particular beliefs to animals, more can now be said vis-a-vis Fido's grasp of the preference belief than was initially possible. When we say that Fido has this belief, we claim that he grasps the connection between choosing bones and satisfying his desire for the flavor bones provide. But can we be right to attribute this belief to him? This will depend on whether we ever have any reason to say that Fido has those expectations regarding bones that he would have if he believed that bones satisfy his desire for a certain taste. These expectations will include getting his mouth on it, chewing it, licking it, tasting a certain flavor, and finding the congeries of these experiences generally pleasant. The accuracy of our attribution of this belief to him will depend on whether we ever find that Fido relates to bones in the way he would if he had these expectations. Here is a simple test to decide. Produce a meaty bone and, in full view of Fido, but while another person is holding him, put the bone down. Observe how the dog behaves. Does he show any interest in the bone? Does it seem that he would like to get his mouth on it pronto? Or does he bark angrily at it, fall asleep, or cower in the corner at the mere sight of this dreaded object? If Fido is a normal dog, we know full well what to expect because we know full well what Fido expects. He expects to have a pleasant time chewing on that bone. Whether, then, we are accurate when we attribute the preference belief to Fido can only be decided by whether we have adequate grounds for thinking that he has those expectations he would have if he has that belief. A crucial part of the test for accuracy will depend on what he does after he is released. Chances are he will show by his behavior that he had those expectations we thought he did when we attributed the preference belief to him. It is important to emphasize that the connection claimed here between believing that P and having certain expectations is not one of identity. It is not being claimed that A believes that P means A expects thus and so. To maintain identity in this case would undermine the intelligibility of citing our beliefs as a way of explaining or justifying what we expect. Suppose that, when Mary heard the noise at the door, she opened it without checking first to see who was there, and a total stranger rushed in and stole her most valuable possessions. Suppose we ask her why she opened the door without first checking, and she replies that she was expecting her friend Nora. It then is perfectly reasonable to ask her why she was expecting her, and what we will want from Mary is a recounting of those beliefs that were relevant to her having that expectation. Now, if the beliefs on which her expectation depended were the same as this expectation itself, all she could be doing when recounting her beliefs would be saying that she had the expectation she had because she had that expectation. This she is manifestly not doing. Her beliefs are the basis for her having the expectation she has. Her believing that P, that Q, and the like is thus not identical with her expecting what she does. When, therefore, it is claimed that it is our knowledge of Fido's expectations on which our attributions of particular beliefs to him must be based, and when, further, it is claimed that the accuracy of these attributions must be tested on the basis of whether Fido behaves as he would behave if he had those expectations he would have if he believed what we attribute to him, it is not being claimed that Fido's believing that P is identical with his expecting thus and so. Like the rest of us, he expects what he does because he believes what he does, so that to say what expectations he has is distinct from, though related to, saying what he believes. When the attribution of particular beliefs to animals is understood in the way argued for in the preceding, and when we bring a holistic perspective to bear on the interpretation of animal behavior, Fry's worries can be assuaged. Fido wags his tail under various circumstances. That is agreed. It is also agreed that the dog's doing just this is compatible with attributing any number of different beliefs to him. And it is also agreed that we therefore cannot say, just on the basis of observing his wagging tail, what it is that Fido believes. Our inability to say what Fido believes just on the basis of his wagging tail, however, does not signify some deficiency in Fido's behavioral repertoire or a lack of behavioral grounds on which we can say what it is that the dog believes. Rather, the supposition that we should even try to say what the dog believes by focusing our attention just on one feature of the dog's behavior, viewed in isolation from the context in which it occurs, points to a failure on Fry's part to understand what behavior is and how a more sensitive appreciation of it can provide the needed grounds for attributing and for testing the attributions of particular beliefs to animals. A holistic view of animal behavior allows us to decide when to attribute beliefs to animals, what beliefs to attribute, and whether the beliefs we have reason to attribute at one time, in one set of circumstances, are the same or different from those we have reason to attribute at another time, in another set of circumstances. If Fido is a normal dog, for example, he will have beliefs about his lunch, and these will differ from those beliefs he has about his friends. He will, therefore, have different expectations when he believes that lunch is at hand than those he has when he believes that a friend is at the door, and he will behave differently because he has these different beliefs. If Fry's dog is a normal dog, he will eat his lunch, not his friend. 2.5. The complexity of animal consciousness. In the previous section, 3 types of objections against attributing the preference belief to Fido were considered and found wanting. In the present section, I indicate, though sketchily, some of the more important implications that follow if, as has been argued, we have good reason to attribute and have a reliable way of deciding the accuracy of the attribution of the preference belief to the dog. As we shall see a great deal, much of it of great importance to our understanding of the mental life of animals, not just Fido in particular, flows from making the minimal case that Fido has the preference belief. The first point worth making is that the argument regarding Fido's grasp of the preference belief obviously can be generalized to provide the content of many other beliefs the dog has, not only about how certain things are to be chosen if he is to satisfy his desire for certain tastes, but also how various other things are to be chosen to satisfy other desires he has. For example, for rest, or warmth, or companionship. Second, this same form of argument obviously can be generalized and applied to other mammals. If Fido is enfranchised into the class of believing animals because he has the preference belief regarding bones, then cats, cows, pigs, horses, llamas, tigers, giraffes, hippos, and cetaceans, for example, cannot be far behind. In the case of those animals who, like Fido, have beliefs, a good deal more follows concerning the cognitive powers they must have. The way to proceed is via a transcendental argument. Given that Fido has the preference belief, how is this possible? It is preposterous to hypothesize that he came into the world with this belief. No one will seriously maintain that dogs are born knowing how bones taste. To find this out, Fido, like the rest of us, had to get his mouth on one. Suppose he does, and suppose the dog lacks memory. Then Fido could not form the preference belief or behave as he does because of what he believes about the connection between the taste of bones and the satisfaction of his desires. This he could not do because the preference belief is a general belief about this connection. If dogs lacked memory, then they could not form any general belief and thus could not grasp the preference belief. Because Fido can be reasonably viewed as having this belief, he is reasonably viewed as having the ability to remember the relevant experiences, bone-tasting ones, even if, unlike us, he cannot say that he does. Fido must be able to do more than remember, however, if he is to grasp the preference belief. He must be able to recognize a bone. But to recognize a bone, Fido must not only be able to perceive, not merely detect by its senses, individual bones. He must also have the ability to abstract from individual cases, form general concepts, for example, the concept of a bone, and apply this concept to particular cases. Without these abilities, there could be no rational account of how Fido grasps the preference belief, since then we have good reason to attribute this belief to him, and to refer to this belief of his when we seek to explain why he behaves as he does. We also have good reason to attribute the ability to form general concepts to him as well. But can Fido have beliefs about the future? If, as has been argued, Fido has expectations about what will occur and beliefs correlated with these expectations, then he certainly has beliefs about the future, a finding that is reinforced by considering a related question. Namely, whether Fido can reasonably be viewed as acting intentionally. If we are reasonably to view any individual, A, as having this ability, we must show that it is reasonable to view A as acting with the intention of achieving a given purpose, for example, satisfying a certain desire. Is Fido able to do this? If we had good reason to deny that Fido can have beliefs, we would have equally good reason to deny that he can act intentionally. And if we had good reason to deny that we can specify what it is that the dog believes, then we would have equally good reason to deny that we are able to say with what intentions he acts, even assuming that he does so. But we have no good reason to deny any of this. The cumulative argument provides defensible grounds for viewing Fido and other mammalian animals as being like us in having beliefs, understood as functional or psychological states, and their behavior provides us with the needed basis for saying what they believe. That being so, there is nothing that logically stands in the way of viewing Fido, for example, as wanting out in order that he may dig where he believes a bone is, and as wanting out, digging and getting hold of that bone in order that he may satisfy his desire for the flavor bones provide. There is, in short, no logical barrier to viewing Fido as acting with the intention of fulfilling his purposes. Not only may we view him thus, however, we ought to, if we view humans as being capable of intentional agency, something which, it bears repeating, is an essential presupposition of any work in moral philosophy. Once we have accepted this in the human case, once the major challenges to crediting animals with awareness and beliefs have been met, and once we have explained how their behavior may be intelligibly described and parsimoniously explained by making reference to what they believe and desire, then we have done all that we can reasonably be required to do to make the case for viewing them, too, as individuals who act intentionally. And once we have made this case, we have additional reasons for crediting Fido and similar animals with beliefs about the future, if we do so in the human case, since to act in the present with the intention of satisfying one's desire in the future, as Fido does when he acts in a way that leads us to let him out, in order that he may satisfy his desire by getting his mouth on the bone he believes we have buried, requires that Fido and these other animals have such beliefs. To recognize the status of mammalian animals as intentional agents paves the way for recognizing that they should also be viewed as self-conscious. For an individual, A, to act now in order to bring about the satisfaction of his desires at some future time is possible only if we assume that A is self-aware, at least to the extent that A believes that it will be his desires that will be satisfied in the future as a result of what he does now. In other words, intentional action is possible only for those who are self-conscious. Since Fido and relevantly similar animals are reasonably viewed as capable of acting intentionally, it must likewise be reasonable to view them as self-aware, and thus, in this case as in others, to view them as models of human mental capacities. As in the case of beliefs, desires, intentions, and the like, self-consciousness is not the exclusive property of Homo sapiens. In sympathy with Gareth Matthews' position, the preceding supports acceptance of what he calls the principle of psychological continuity. The psychology of human beings is part of the psychology of animals generally. A final implication of the preceding is worth noting. The validity of attributions of belief to animals and our ability to specify the content of their beliefs underpin the propriety of viewing animals as having an emotional life, a point upon which Darwin, for instance, repeatedly insists, and one that can only be reinforced if we recall the lessons learned by Hebb and his associates. Except for pathological cases, which in the nature of the case are the exception, not the rule, to be afraid, for example, is to fear that something in particular will occur, while to feel anger is to feel anger towards someone or something because of what has been done. Normally, that is, one does not, for example, fear that something will happen without believing that it will or is likely to occur. Not surprisingly, Fry doubts that animals can or do have emotions because he denies that they can or do have beliefs. But while Fry seems to be on the side of the truth when he claims that emotions, or at least a good many of them, are not possible without belief, he is not similarly positioned when he denies an emotional life to animals or doubts that they have one because they lack beliefs. No good argument has been given to support this denial, and there are strong presumptive reasons for attributing beliefs to them. When, therefore, Darwin refers to the terror, suspicion, affection, and jealousy of mammalian animals, what he writes cannot rationally be dismissed as the breezy anthropomorphism of a mind with its scientific guard down. The recognition of emotion in man and animals, in Hebb's words, is not fundamentally different. Finally, a problem analogous to one considered in the previous chapter must be discussed. The earlier problem concerned where to draw the line between those animals that are and those that are not conscious or aware. The answer offered was that this is to be decided by appeal to the cumulative argument, including the implications of evolutionary theory. The greater the anatomical and physiological similarity between given animals and paradigmatic conscious beings, that is, normal developed human beings, the stronger our reasons are for viewing these animals as being like us in having the material basis for consciousness. The less like us a given animal is in these respects, the less reason we have for viewing them as having a mental life. Because some animals frequently differ from us in quite fundamental ways in these respects, it is not unreasonable to view them as utterly lacking in consciousness. Like automatic garage doors that open when they register an electronic signal, or like the pinball machine that registers the overly aggressive play of a competitor and lights up tilt, some animals may be reasonably viewed as making their behavioral moves in the world without any awareness of it. Certainly, to claim that some animals are conscious is not to commit oneself to the view that all animals are. The present problem concerns where one draws the line regarding the relative complexity of the conscious lives of various animals. To claim that some animals are aware of their environment, have beliefs and desires, possess memory and expectations about, and thus a sense of the future, and are able to act intentionally in seeking to fulfill their desires or purposes, does not commit one to the view that all conscious animals are similarly endowed. Not only is it possible, it is highly probable, given the major thrust of evolutionary theory, that some conscious animals have a rudimentary mental life, living, we might conjecture, in a perpetual specious present, having no memory of the past nor conscious anticipation of the future, yet experiencing, for example, something akin to pleasure when certain things happen in or to their bodies, and something akin to pain when other events take place. If we assume what evolutionary theory implies, that the more complex forms of conscious life evolved from the less complex, then the existence of animals having a rudimentary mental life is inescapable. Where we draw the line in these and related cases is, of course, certain to be controversial. And yet we can be as certain as we reasonably can be that, say, single-celled animals are utterly lacking in consciousness, and that animals with a primitive central nervous system have the bare minimum for rudimentary consciousness. However, for our purposes, the crucial question is not where we draw the line in every case. It is whether we have good reason to draw the line in a way that implies that mammalian animals not only are conscious and sentient, but also have beliefs, desires, memory, a sense of the future, self-awareness, and an emotional life, and can act intentionally. The reply the present chapter has sought to clarify and defend may be summed up in 2 words. We do. The problem over line drawing actually is more complicated than has been indicated up to now. For though it is reasonable to view mammalian animals as individuals having a complex mental life of the sort described, it is neither necessary nor reasonable to view them in this way at every stage of their physical development or deterioration. At the moment of conception, for example, or after having suffered massive brain damage, neither cats nor dogs are reasonably viewed as having beliefs or desires, goals or preferences, sensations or emotions. Whether they have a mental life approaching this complexity when they are first born also is controversial. Precisely when this family of mental abilities emerges or recedes during the biological life of a given mammalian animal, exactly where, that is, we draw the line in this regard, is as vexing a question as is its companion query concerning human beings. Few, if any, even including the most avid champions of the fetus's right to life, will claim that the human fetus has beliefs and emotions, for example, at the moment of conception, or that a physically mature human being continues to have a sophisticated mental life when in an irreversible coma. Like mammalian animals, in short, humans can both acquire and lose the family of mental abilities discussed in the present chapter. As is true in the case of these animals, we cannot erase the difficult problem of where to draw the line concerning an individual human's acquisition or loss of these abilities. But though this problem cannot be erased, its difficulty can be lessened without begging any essential questions at this point. Whether a human fetus at the later stage of its development has memory, beliefs, or desires is, let us agree, a controversial question. But whether a child of a year or more has these abilities, assuming the child is not very seriously mentally enfeebled, is not open to serious doubt unless one is the victim of a mistaken analysis of the concepts of belief, desire, and the like. Similarly, whether a fetal or newborn dog has these abilities is perhaps open to informed debate. Not so in the case of a normal dog of a year or more, assuming the soundness of the analyses and arguments advanced in the proceeding. That much granted, we can adopt a conservative policy at this point, one that leaves the line-drawing question unanswered when it arises at the level of individuals, but a policy that enables us to move forward in spite of leaving this question unresolved. The policy is simply this. Henceforth, when either humans or animals are referred to, it is to be assumed that those to whom we refer are individuals well beyond the point where anyone could reasonably draw the line separating those who have the mental abilities in question from those who lack them. Unless otherwise indicated, that is, the word humans will be used to refer to all those Homo sapiens aged 1 year or more who are not very profoundly mentally impaired or otherwise quite markedly mutually impoverished, for example, permanently comatose. And unless indicated otherwise, the word animal will be used to refer to mentally normal mammals of a year or more. To stipulate at this point how the words human and animal will be used allows for economy of expression in the sequel and should not occasion misunderstanding. Just to be on the safe side, some reminders will be posted along the way. Here it will serve the interests of communication well to note that, though the argument for animal rights offered in the sequel applies most clearly to those animals covered by the stipulated use of the word animal, related considerations will be offered to explain why important moral constraints also apply to our dealings with other animals. 2.6. Summary and Conclusion. A variety of reasons make it reasonable to view mammalian animals as individuals who, like us, have beliefs and desires. Common sense and ordinary language support this, as does evolutionary theory. Their behavior is consistent with this view, and the question of the relative mental sophistication and powers of these animals is only confusedly tied to asking whether they have immaterial, immortal souls. These reasons, taken together, the cumulative argument, provide the basis for a burden of proof argument, unless or until we are shown that there are better reasons for denying that these animals have beliefs and desires, we are rationally entitled to believe that they do. What Stephen Stitch calls our intuitive belief-desire theory wins, one might say, unless those who dispute it show that it loses. R.G. Fry is one philosopher who endeavors to meet the burden of proof. On Fry's view, animals do not have desires because they cannot have them. They cannot have desires properly conceived, he thinks, because to have desires involves having beliefs, and only those individuals who have language can have beliefs. Fry's position that beliefs are impossible for those who lack language was shown to be untenable, because, among other reasons, it leads to the absurd consequence that no one can believe anything. On Fry's view, since there can be no beliefs without one's having mastered a language, at least to the point where one can frame or understand sentences, and since learning a language requires that one have pre-verbal beliefs about what is being taught, we must conclude that no one can learn a language, and so, on his view, no one can believe anything. To exclude animals from the class of individuals who have beliefs by means of an account of belief that entails that this class is empty is a Pyrrhic victory at best. Stitch is representative of a second type of challenge to applying the belief-desire theory to animals. Beliefs and desires are, Stitch allows, psychological states, and Stitch evidently concedes that the cumulative argument supports viewing normal mammalian animals, aged 1 or more, as having, in his words, a large store of both desires and beliefs. But beliefs and desires also have content. To believe something is to believe that something is the case. And it is in this connection, he thinks, that animal belief eludes our grasp. We simply cannot say what they believe despite having more than ample reason to suppose that they have beliefs, understood as psychological states. The belief-desire theory, one might say on Stitch's behalf, is half a theory at best when applied to animals. Stitch's grounds for claiming that we cannot say what animals believe were shown to rest on an unsatisfactory understanding of when individuals have the same concept. Two individuals can have the same concept more or less. They need not share all and only the same beliefs about a given X in order to share the same concept of X. A child, for example, who knows nothing about chemistry, does not therefore have an entirely different concept of milk or bottle than we do. When viewed in this way, normal mammalian animals aged 1 or more are reasonably viewed as sharing many of our concepts. Fido's concept of a bone was used to illustrate the general point at issue. Since at least one of the beliefs that informs our concept of a bone, namely the preference belief, bones are to be chosen to satisfy the desire for a certain flavor, is a belief we have good reason to believe that Fido shares. And since, assuming Stitch is right, we have no good reason to maintain that Fido denies any of the other beliefs about bones that comprise our concept, the dog is reasonably viewed as having our concept, at least to a limited degree. The content of Fido's concept of and beliefs about bones, and generalizing on the dog's case, the content of and beliefs about many other things on the part of mammalian animals generally, is thus in principle determinable, at least a little bit. In a broad range of cases, they believe what we believe. This finding might be challenged in a variety of ways. Among the challenges considered, one disputed our ability to say what animals believe on the basis of how they behave. A second disputed our ability to say what their experience is like, since all we have to go on is their nonverbal behavior. With regard to the latter objection, it was argued that it is unparsimonious to multiply kinds of experience, canine, feline, human, etc., beyond necessity, something we would be guilty of if we assumed that, say, canine taste experience must differ from our own. In reply to the former objection, the point was made that behavior must be understood holistically, not atomistically. If we are to use animal behavior to fix the content of animal belief, we must be certain not to fix our attention, as Fry implies we should, on isolated bodily movements, for example, the wag of a dog's tail. We must ask whether animals behave as they predictably would if they had those beliefs we attribute to them, a question that can be answered only if we take the time to view the animal's behavior holistically. For example, if we investigate what else the dog does in addition to wagging his tail, how he wags it, when he does it, etc. The accuracy of our attributions of belief to animals depends upon and is testable by making reference to whether their behavior shows that they have those expectations they would have if they have the beliefs attributed to them, something that is in principle determinable by determining whether the animals in question behave as they reasonably could be predicted to behave if they had the appropriate expectations. At least in a great many cases, in short, the content of animals' beliefs is empirically determinable. Having made the case for viewing animals such as Fido as individuals who have beliefs and desires, assuming, as always, that human beings do, some of the more important implications were then sketched. These animals are reasonably viewed as having the ability to act intentionally if humans are similarly conceived. They initiate action because they want this or seek that, and they act as they do in order to satisfy these desires. They do not merely react to external stimuli, as plants bend toward the light. Moreover, because beliefs such as the preference belief are general beliefs about the connection between choice and the satisfaction of desire, these animals must not only be able to perceive individual objects, for example, this bone, they must also be able to remember and, on the basis of past experience, form general concepts. And since many of the beliefs they have involve their having expectations about the future, these animals must also have a sense of the future. indeed a sense of their own future. As individuals who initiate a chain of events now, in the present, with the intention of bringing about the satisfaction of their desires in the future, these animals are reasonably viewed as having a grasp of, that is, beliefs and correlative expectations about, their own future. Thus are they reasonably viewed as being not only conscious, but self-conscious. Perception, memory, desire, belief, self-consciousness, intention, a sense of the future. These are among the leading attributes of the mental life of normal mammalian animals aged 1 or more. Add to this list the not unimportant categories of emotion, for example fear and hatred, and sentience, understood as the capacity to experience pleasure and pain, and we begin to approach a fair rendering of the mental life of these animals. To deny a mental life of this complexity to these creatures in favor of, for example, a stimulus-response theory of their behavior, while affirming a complex mental life to human beings is, let us agree, a theoretical possibility. But one wants arguments to support viewing humans and animals so differently, arguments that meet the burden of proof issued by the cumulative argument. This chapter examined major arguments that explicitly address the question of animal beliefs and desires. Though not all the options could be examined, and while it was freely conceded that not all the controversies discussed along the way were settled with philosophical finality, enough was considered and argued, it is to be hoped, to show that these major arguments failed to meet the burden of proof. To continue, in the face of the failure of these arguments, to apply a stimulus-response theory to animals, but to favor the application of the belief-desire theory to humans, or, worse still, to disparage those who describe to this latter understanding of animals and their behavior as anthropomorphizers, is to bespeak a prejudice rather than to unmask one. To cling to and perpetuate a vision of the world that concedes a primitive mental life to animals, or, for there are closet Cartesians in our midst, to deny any mental life to them, is as far removed from having an accurate conception of what these animals are like as the lion in Stefan Lochner's painting is from representing a real lion.